Yeah, I've always lived in the UK. I'm now based in Manchester, and I did my undergraduate and my master's, and I've completed my PhD there as well.
Okay, okay. First time you're in the Netherlands?
Yeah, well, it's my first time in Utrecht, but I've been in Amsterdam before.
Okay, all right. So tell me, tonight, 10 o'clock tonight, your piece will be performed?
Yes.
In the
Nicolai.
Yes. Nicolai Kerk, right?
Yeah, in the late night concert at 10.
Yeah. So could you tell a bit about your work?
Yeah. The piece is called Switched On, which is made from a collection of sound recordings from light switches, dials and buttons that I found quite interesting. The way I work is I collect sounds from the environment around me, and then I take these into the studio and create a sort of montage or composition from these sound recordings. Mm-hmm. So I'm very much an akoesmatic composer, where I'm working in a very fixed time domain. So my work in the studio involves organising the sound into the shape I want it to be in. So I'm very much sort of in the process of making the sounds fit together. Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited about this sort of method of composition. Yeah. And it's my preferred mode of composing.
Yeah, rather doing it this way than writing for acoustic instruments?
Yes, I've always been much interested in sort of sound rather than sort of writing and notating things for instruments. It doesn't mean that I don't write for instruments, but I go about it in a very different way. Yeah. So with instruments, I will often record them and then find something I like and then maybe notate it. So it's maybe the long way around, but it is a very different process from thinking first and then writing.
Yeah. So you could come, so to speak, you could end up in a composition for acoustic instruments as a result of working the electronic.
Very much so, and I've done this twice in the past for a piece for percussion, where I recorded a cajon, which is a Latin American drum, and it ended up being an akoesmatic piece, but then I transcribed the cajon line, which seemed apparent in the piece, and then gave it to the performer, and they played with the tape. So it has two versions, and it happened again in an electric guitar piece called Vista Points. Again, I transcribed the line for the performer, and it became another piece. But I don't believe I could come to those conclusions from writing a piece first and giving it to the performer. It would have to be through exploration first. Yeah. Okay. So a very different way of composing.
Yeah, yes. Is that because of wanting to have the sound as a starting point rather than, say, the notes on paper?
I think so. I'm much more excited by sound. Once hearing it or auditioning it, I then become excited, and I can see the value in those sounds. I don't think maybe I'm capable of hearing something before I record it. Yeah. So it's maybe it's the missing link, but maybe that's the way I work. Yeah. But I perhaps maybe it can be seen as the long way round, but I enjoy the process of discovering in that whole sort of journey of looking through these sounds.
Yeah. Could you tell a bit about influences? Are there specific composers or records or whatever which were of an influence?
Okay, there's many sources of influence. Maybe not all from sort of the music world. I often get inspiration from everyday occurrences. Maybe there is a composer that is influential, but sometimes maybe it's not. So in terms of music, I'd say that the works of Dennis Smalley, who is a big composer in the UK, is particularly influential upon my work. His theoretical writings are really important to the way I think about sound. And also I'm really heavily influenced by visual shapes and forms. I find that this is a real big it provides a big guide for me when I'm sort of working with sound, because I believe that I'm sculpting sound in a way that a sculptor might sculpt a piece of clay or a painting or something more visual. So I actually feel that if I maybe think more tangibly, like visually, then I think I might get further, or my result might be more solid in that way.
Yeah. So could you say that sound has a form which can be compared to the form of physical things?
Oh, definitely. Right. I'm really a big promoter of this idea.
Okay.
And I've got very interested in illustration as a means of talking about my work. So if I was to give a presentation about my music, I might show a picture of how the piece evolves rather than try and describe it with many words. It's simply identifiable in a picture of maybe sort of triangles and circles and shapes, and this is a great way of communicating how my pieces evolve, because we all have some archetypal understanding of sound. We all know about sort of crescendos and diminuendos and so on, and granular sounds. We all know what that means, but I think we can distill it to some finite shapes.
Yeah. So, and the sounds which we will be hearing tonight, they're all from switches and is it a clicking sort of sound? Or?
Yeah, I became fascinated with short sounds. A lot of my music deals with very brief moments of sonic material, and I really felt like I wanted to explore this to the extreme in this piece. So I came across switches as a sound source because, once you press them on, that sound is gone. It's not around for very long. So this seemed like the perfect material to exploit in this work. So collecting sort of switches and dials and buttons and things that we have around us, like lights and oven and microwave buttons. These are all things we know about. They just seemed the perfect sort of material to capture because of their short duration. And then this allowed me to do a lot of piecework within the composition, so moving them into perfect synchronicity with each other. It was just a very nice experience working with such nice sound material.
Yeah, but it must have been quite a job to get all these short sounds into a composition of some scale.
Yes,
right?
I think I set myself a bit of a challenge with so many sounds. I have no idea how many sounds there are actually in there because of the shortness of them. I'm sure there's hundreds, thousands, and so on.
Sure.
But as you say, I've given myself more work in a way by making an 8-minute piece with sounds that are even a second long.
Yeah.
So the organisation takes time, and as a composer, I know I take a long time over composing. The shortest time has been 9 months to finish a work, so it does take time.
Yeah, sure. And then again, writing a composition on paper takes time as well.
Yeah.
Or in a.
So it's perhaps on maybe the craft is in synchronizing sound for me, and maybe in a paper composer, they take the time deliberating over choices that go on the score. So maybe that's the comparison.
Yeah. Could you imagine it works the other way around? You took your starting point in the clicking sounds and the typical sounds of switches, which in itself are normally, in any case, rather dull. I mean, most switches sort of sound alike, except for the TV switch, which I think you described. But could you imagine making music to make sure that switches will sound more interesting?
Oh, that's
like like a microwave oven, for instance, with beep, 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 and it doesn't matter what you do; it's the same beep all the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, it would be more fun, right?
I think you make a really good point here, and the more I compose, the more I see this happening. A lot of composers choose a source material, such as switches or whatever you want, and then they begin to understand that sound world in a great detail, and they begin to be experts almost in the world of switches. So other composers, maybe if they're doing a piece about the ocean, they become to know the ocean more than they did before they started the piece. So it's a learning process. It's very educational. I'm not saying that I know the world of electronics, sort of.
No, but you have a starting point.
But
right?
it is, definitely. And you become to hear the subtleties in maybe different switches. But in collecting the recordings, I was curious to collect as many different types of switches. And as you said, a lot sound the same. So it was a challenge to find many different ones, and I was asking many people,
to record their switches.
Have you got a switch in your house that is unique? And many people said, my switch makes this funny humming sound, and my switch does this when you do it, and so on. So there was many to collect, and the most interesting ones perhaps were the older ones, like the television, which was from 20 years ago, when it took time to power up, and those really sort of captured my imagination. And once I heard that, it began to inspire this idea of what happens when you turn something on. It sort of powers up and it comes to life. You sort of set it in motion. So that's the idea with the piece, where it sort of comes alive. And I hope that maybe that's conveyed in the piece somehow. And at the end, you hear the whole piece sort of come to an end as it's switched off.
It's switched off, literally.
Yeah. So
one of the reasons I was thinking about reversing the process and composing sounds for switches in practical daily life is that, of course, electroacoustic music is something which has a practice. Listening to it takes a lot of devotion, so to speak. Your audience will have to be prepared to listen to something where, most times nothing happens on stage. There's no violinist or piano player, who does his act on stage. So, is there any thought you would have about how could you put electroacoustic music in an environment, or present it in a way which is developed from the traditional way of listening to electroacoustic music, which comes from speakers.
I am putting my audience in a very sort of unnatural position when I surround them with this sound. I mean, it's an everyday sound in a very unusual concert hall setting. So I understand the sort of conflict that might be taking place there. But I tried to create a purely oral experience where I often encourage the listeners to close their eyes and recreate whatever their minds, imagine.
Yeah.
But in terms of taking that sound and applying it to maybe an everyday situation, I would be more than happy to, suggest my sounds might be used in sort of new microwave sounds or new. It has definitely an application in all these other things. I think that certain sort of sound artists do sound design for a range of products, and I've known of composers who do sound logos. So they might take a piece, a chunk of their piece, and use it as a sort of brand sound for a major company. So this happens quite a lot. So I mean, I'm sure this is a possibility. It just takes a bit of maybe persuading.
and maybe it takes a bit extra courage on the side of the producers, of the manufacturers of daily life products to use developed or composed sounds instead of what they're using right now, or the sound which is generated by the nature of the object. I think, wasn't it Brian Eno who composed the startup sound for Windows? I think a lot of effort has been put into, for instance, the sound of the closing of doors of expensive cars. So why not, if you're going through all that effort, why not compose a beautiful sound when you close the door? It should be possible, right?
Or turn the light off and then suddenly...
It sounds like something.
It
would be nice.
It's a wealth of possibilities, and I think electroacoustic music is very applicable to the outside world. It has so many uses, but it is really up to the composer sometimes to make that link and maybe share their capabilities with the rest of the world.